We're going to talk today about evictions and terminating the lease. Terminating a lease is tricky, and evictions are both tricky topics, and they can't just be easily done. You got to have cause. You got to have a reason why you're doing that. As I've looked into both of these, let's dive into them. Let's talk about these and help people understand how they can terminate a lease, how a landlord can terminate a lease, who's right and wrong in eviction, and how that all happens.
Yeah, you're right that they're not easy, but there's mechanisms out there, and it's important to go over those mechanisms. So for terminating a lease, there's really 5, I'm going to call them reasons to terminate a lease, or approaches to terminate a lease. And they are that the expiration of the lease has come about just through the normal course of time. Then you have early termination, mutual agreement, breach of a lease by the landlord, or certain legal protections or circumstances. And we'll get into each one of those. The first, I think, is the easiest, is you have a 12-month lease, the end of the lease is coming up, but just because the date passes doesn't mean the lease expires. Is terminated, right? So maybe talk about that for a minute. So
the misconception is our lease expires on this date, therefore the lease, we're out of there, it ends. Well, most leases have a clause in there that state that if once the date ends, then it converts to a month-to-month tenancy. Yeah. So that's automatically, it'll just convert automatically. So unless a tenant gives the landlord a notice that they are moving on that termination date, it will convert to a month-to-month. Hence, it's important to give a notice still when you're going to vacate at that lease date.
Yep, and just be mindful of the dates. Dates are important in real estate. And so the end of the lease, you still have to give your notice. And a landlord could also give a notice at that point too. It's not just the tenant only. The landlord can come back and say, we're deciding we're not going to renew the lease when it comes to its end. And as long as they give you that in 30 days in advance, then you've got to be out by that date. And so it's a communication piece.
Some people think converting to a month-to-month is better. Well, it may not be, because now the landlord can terminate your tenancy at any time, not just the tenant. So if you know you're going to be in a place for 2 years or so, try to agree to a longer-term contract, so you not get forced out with a simple notice by the landlord.
All right, let's talk about early termination. Most leases today have an early termination clause that allow a tenant to terminate as long as they give a 30-day notice, but it usually has a financial obligation to, like a lease break fee,
a buyout fee,
or a buyout fee, and that'll vary from lease to lease. So as you're going through the leasing process and you're concerned about that, just look into it. In our market, we've had a lot of people that will look at the termination clause because they are really trying to buy a house, and they're renting a place because they haven't found the perfect home yet, and they want to know, well, what's that cost going to be to me to terminate? And that's a normal thing that's out there. It occurs more often than you'd think.
Might be beneficial to the tenant.
Yeah, because if you have 6 months left on your lease and you find the perfect house, you know you at least have a methodology to get there. It does cost money, and so it's not a freebie. But
that is the discretion of the landlord, right? They may.
It is.
I mean, it might be a mutual benefit for both.
And that kind of brings us into that terminate by mutual agreement, right? The landlord may also be in a position to say, hey, if I can get the tenant to move out, I can increase my rent by X. So it might be a mutually beneficial thing for him to do by letting the tenant out ahead of schedule. So there's several things that could create that mutual agreement, right?
Okay, so the third way to terminate a lease would be a breach.
So the breach of a lease. So a breach would be by the landlord in this particular case. As we talk a little bit later about eviction, that's really where the tenant has breached. And we'll go for that. But it doesn't happen often, but a landlord can breach a lease, right? And we've talked about the Fit Premises Act, and that's usually where the landlord can get into some trouble.
Yeah, we've talked about it quite a bit.
Yeah. And so one of the most common ones is the habitability. So let's say that the sewer line collapses and backs up into the house. Obviously, nobody wants to stay in a stinky home, right?
Not most people, but
there's some.
Some, I guess.
Yeah, most people don't. But if the landlord doesn't correct that in a reasonable time, a tenant can break the lease legally under a landlord violation of that. And so there's some very specific laws, and so what we encourage you to do is to check the local jurisdiction of what those laws apply, but usually fit premise is pretty straightforward, and there's a notification process that you need to give to the landlord.
Watch our video on the Fit Premises Act if you're interested in knowing more about what those.
The mechanics of it.
Yeah, the mechanics, the things that could happen, you know, a broken furnace, air conditioner, things like that they're obligated to keep.
Yep.
Landlords obligated to keep up and
Because
running.
you as a tenant, you have a definite, specific right to have a quality place to live. Nobody likes a slumlord. Not even the slumlords don't even like themselves.
Some of them do, unfortunately. Some of them
But
do.
most good investors want to have a nice place to live because they know in the long term it's mutually beneficial for both to have a good quality place. So, but it's important for you to know that. Tell us about the fifth one, the legal protections. Give me maybe a circumstance on that.
On the legal protection, so sometimes people get in a situation that's not good or safe, right? Something might be like abuse in a relationship. Domestic violence, I guess, is a big word.
And unfortunately, we've seen that increasing over time, or at least it's becoming more known, more publicized.
Yeah. So if there is something like that happening, and the landlord finds out about it, drug dealing, things like that, there can be an early termination.
But the protections and circumstances that we're talking about here is more of a change in the tenant's perspective. And let's use the domestic violence, where it's created an unsafe environment. It really is to the benefit of the landlord to end it, because if there's no stability in the home, it's not a matter of if problems are going to happen, it's when, right? And it's going to come really soon. And so it's really a mutual benefit at that point in time. It's just the reason behind it has changed. But there are protections out there. So if you're a victim of domestic violence and you're on a lease, there are legal remedies for you to protect yourself, and that's important to know out there.
Yeah, just keep in mind that if you're facing something like that, any kind of decision that is causing you to be in that kind of situation, seek legal advice. We have some references that we can provide through our Facebook page and help that can assist you, but you might need to seek legal help or professional help at that time. But let us, if you feel comfortable letting us
reach out
direct
to us.
you, we'd love to help you.
Yep.
All right, so let's move forward to the evictions.
Now, evictions, like I said earlier, is really where a tenant has breached the lease, right? And so you mentioned earlier, if you're arrested for drug dealing or another offense, that can be cause for a landlord to evict for cause, right? That's what it's called, is eviction for cause. There's a handful of ways that you can get evicted out there. One is for non-payment, one's for eviction for cause, any type of cure that they can do an eviction.
Yep, I've got here a couple of them. So
yeah, what do you got?
I got non-payment, termination of a lease, of course, violation of the terms, expiration of the terms, or any criminal activity.
So one of the things that's interesting there, you have a non-compliance. So let's say that under the lease, you're required to take care of the yard, and you fail to do that. That is a particular thing. But what I find interesting is the landlord has to give you opportunity to cure that process. They can't just show up and say, all right, the lease is over, and you have to fold up, and pack up, and move out. There's a process. He has to give you notice of, here's where you're deficient at. Here's the time frame you have to solve it in. Otherwise, I'll move for eviction, right? Now, with the exception of, let's say it's drug dealing, for example, there is no cure for that. It's move out. Of course, it's at the discretion of the landlord. He could say, you're a drug dealer, but I'll accept it.
Does the landlord have to prove that there
Yeah.
for sure has been criminal activity?
They have to have enough evidence to support it. So if there's a police report filed, it's sufficient, right? They can't go off of hearsay, right? They can't just say, a neighbor whispers in your ear and says, hey, Bob over there's dealing. That's insufficient.
So if you see the landlord park their car outside monitoring people for a couple of days, maybe.
He might be looking for evidence,
Yeah.
right? But he has to have it substantiated out there.
So one thing that I wanted to point out, that in Utah there's no curing period, right? We have no law stating that once an eviction notice is filed, there's no law saying that a tenant has a time period to correct the problem, and therefore the termination notice is voided.
That's correct.
Correct. So once that eviction process is started, in Utah anyway, you don't have any legal bounds to correct it and stay there and move forward.
There are some exceptions, like in order to do an eviction for non-payment, the paperwork itself does give a 3-day pay or quit by
Correct.
statute,
Correct.
right? But once that's started, if the 3 days is passed, you're exactly right. You can't come back after that 3 days and make it up. You know, the landlord could accept it, you know, but it's not by default. But on the 3-day pay or quit, if you make that payment, then you're cured, basically.
Correct.
I'm cured.
Yeah.
On there.
Because that'll happen all the time. That's the first thing that landlords will do, post a 3-day pay or vacate notice. Yeah. And that thanks for correcting that. You do. Yep. You can't correct that.
But there are other corrections that don't require, you know, the landlord doesn't have to accept that you've gone out and mowed the lawn today if you're being evicted for cause for that breach. He doesn't have to accept that you've mowed the lawn because the breach is already accrued, right? Now, as a business person, you might want to consider that, but he doesn't have to. So if you're in a tight rental market like we are today, just mow the frickin' lawn.
Yeah, and it's important for people to know that landlords do have to go through certain steps.
Yep.
When evicting, and so we'll give you more help on that later. But if they don't follow certain steps, then they can't just come and lock the doors, right?
Right.
They must have a court order in Utah to do those type of things. To even proceed with the eviction process, they have to have a court order. Change the locks, they have to have a court order. They shut off utilities, take tenants' belongings, harass the tenants. They can't do any of that stuff. They can't block it, they can't remove the front door, they can't do anything without a court order. In their attempt to try to make living in the apartment uncomfortable, they can't do it.
And we've seen some where a homeowner will attempt to make it uncomfortable for the tenants so that they just leave.
Yeah, I'm sure members of Tenant Solutions has had that happen to them. It's unfortunate, and it shouldn't. But hopefully we're not in that position where a landlord doesn't want us there. So.
Yeah. So I think it goes back to the other things we've talked about before is having a good relationship with your landlord and good communication. But if you do find yourself in an eviction process, obviously it's a healthy practice to go out and seek counsel on it.
For sure.
To make that work. But again, know that you do have certain rights. They can't come up and, you know, even if you've decided that you're not going to fight it and you're going to go ahead and move out in that 3-day period, they can't come in and turn your utilities off in advance. They can't block your driveway to make it so you can't, you know, back a truck up into the driveway to move out. Those are some things that if they start doing that, it actually would give you some leverage in a legal spectrum.
So I would say if you start to experience that, if somebody's doing that to you, I would call the police or the sheriff's office, call them right away, tell them that the landlord does not have a legal notice, even an eviction notice. If they don't do anything, I would call their supervisor, and I would try to escalate that. If they still don't do anything, it's time to call an attorney. There's help in Utah, there's helplines, and there's people that you can get in touch, and we'll provide that information. But don't settle for a wrongful eviction is what I'm promoting here.
A lot of times tenants will feel like they're powerless. Yeah. And the reality is the laws in our current jurisdiction are very balanced. It doesn't favor one party over the other, but it gives very specific areas and duties to go through. And a shameless plug for Tenant Solutions is we want to empower tenants and landlords alike so they understand what are the lanes I need to stay in, and if I see that I'm not being treated correctly, what are my remedies, right? What are my solutions? I'll tell you that empowerment is a night and day difference of having a good night's sleep versus having some massive stress in your life.
Yeah, and I like what you said about both parties. It's empowering both parties, but we're advocating for tenants here. We're advocating for you. Hopefully, as we've gone through this discussion, that we've shared things that are helpful to you. If you ever find yourself in this kind of a position or situation that's uncomfortable, has to do with evictions or terminating a lease, feel free to reach out and talk to us more about it. So,
awesome.
Thanks for joining us.